Hi there, everybody. Thank you for attending today's workshop on the measurement of ideology. And my name is Flavio Azevedo, and this work is done together with DJ Ballista. And we're both located in Germany. And today's workshop is about the measurement of ideology. First, I'd like to thank the organizers of Amos for such a great event. And today I'll present this work in progress on the topic of measurement and meta-science that deep dives into the measurement practices in the study of ideology. So thank you for coming today. All right, the presentation is organized as follows. We'll first have the briefest introduction to the study of ideology. We will address the motivation for our research question and provide a summary of the presentation so you know from the get-go where this presentation is heading towards. Then we'll review the presentation's main claims, and then I'll go over the methods and the results of the two studies that we'll present today. The first one being a systematic review of the literature, and the second one being an empirical study. And finally, we'll wind up the presentation by discussing some of the solutions and approaches to the issues we will find and discuss, and what we can do about them to make our science more cumulative and on the topic of ideology. All right, so this is a briefest introduction to topic of ideology. So one, ideology is measured in numerous disciplines ranging from social sciences to genetics, humanities, use it as a dependent variable, predictor, covariate, mediator, moderator, etc. But as well as to enroll participants in studies, right? So there are three main approaches to the study of ideology. The first one focuses on the etiology and ideational content of ideology. So think of the analytical study of big ideological currents like socialism, conservatism, anarchism, libertarianism, and so forth. So that is the main cluster, one of the main clusters. The second emphasizes the mediums through which ideology propagates or is expressed. So it looks at discursive communicative practices by societies and across cultures, and how these and how institutions help this communication of ideologies. And the third, which is the focus of today, is at the individual level, which takes ideology in a few senses, but taken explicitly known to their bearers, right? How they people themselves conceive of their own ideology. And there's two facets of this. One is the symbolic ideology that is tied to one sense of identity and identification. And there is operational ideology, which refers to the policy preferences that one supports, right? So depends also, ideology kind of depends on political interest, sophistication, and may have several, 1, 2, or 3 dimensions. So it depends on your conceptualization of dimensionality, first of all, but also what you're trying to explain. All right, so the importance of ideology to the study of social sciences and humanities kind of beg the question how researchers studying ideology are measuring ideology. What are the current practices? So to our knowledge, there's an agreement on the lack of conceptual and theoretical consensus. There's not, as of yet, a study assessing these topics. So to address this question, we reviewed measurement practices by coding these practices as observed in more than 400 articles published in several journals across social sciences. So that entails economics, sociology, but mostly political science, psychology, Yeah. So this quantitative review produced several different findings. First, there's a lot of heterogeneity in how ideologies measure. Second, in addition to this heterogeneity of instruments, the content of each instrument. So, for example, think of LGBT rights, immigration, abortion, welfare, healthcare, etc. They tend to overlap so little in these scales and these instruments that we doubt that these scales are actually tapping into the same construct. Third, we also find that when using the same ideological instrument, there's so much variability in how instruments are applied, even, again, the same instrument, that erases the doubt on whether we can compare studies even across not across studies that use the same ideological measurement. So we'll talk about Wilson and Patterson as a case study for this, which is the most used ideological scale. And fourth, and perhaps most important of all, when using different scales to test established theories in both political science and psychology, we show empirically that different ideological instruments do find different results. So it can yield different results. So the substantial heterogeneity of these scales and the low overlapping content may lead to research results that are idiosyncratic and particular scales that are used, which poses a threat to the replicability and generalizability of ideological research. And we believe that this is not only a problem for ideological researchers interested in ideology, but this is a problem that is more broad into social sciences. And I don't mean to name a few, but there's many scales, for example, measuring the same construct in clinical psychology, but also in social psychology, emotions. There's quite a few papers there, socioeconomic status, that talks about the same ideas that we're talking here, but applied to different constructs. All right, so the main takeaway of the presentation, again, this is just to situate you within the presentations that we've been conducting research on ideology as if we are all using the same measure, a single predefined, well-tested, cross-nationally validated ideological measure. So we're currently doing research as if we had a standardized measure, but we are not, and we're going to discuss the implications of this. All right, so this is the main principal claim. So basically, the findings in political behavior, the psychology thereof, in political science, social and political psychology, as well as the perseverance of long-standing debates, for example, polarization, ideology, ideological symmetry, social and economic ideologies for different psychological paths to ideological endorsement, are, at least in part, and I would argue a lot, influenced by the idiosyncratic selection of measures and measurement practices in general. So how do people go about this? So the routine practice is to measure ideology with one instrument, which may vary widely from one another in content, number of items, scoring systems, dimensionality, and so on, but draw conclusions about ideology in general, relying on the assumption that measures are interchangeable. That is, if we swap from one to another, nothing would change, and papers and streams of the literature are comparable, and we can learn from all these findings as if this is cumulative science. So the standard practice is to tacitly assume that ideological inventories can be used interchangeably. So we conduct research using one ideological instrument, or in many cases, a selection, and I would say an idiosyncratic selection of items from surveys like AES and GSS, but draw conclusions whenever we're writing about our results on the nature of ideology in general. And note that by the important field differences between, for example, political science, which mostly measures ideology by selecting items, and psychologists, which mostly create items themselves. The conclusions of the study or the results of the study apply to these both. All right, but should the tacit assumption of interchangeability not hold, that is, if swapping instruments from one to another, if that doesn't work, this poses a serious problem to the first comparability of existing findings. So when you're trying to make sense of existing studies, but also to the robustness and replicability of findings when you're trying to understand the differences between studies. And hence, poses a problem to generalizability of findings altogether, right? So all of which impact negatively our ability to accumulate knowledge and move our science forward. So it's dependent, however, on the severity of this variability that we're going to find in the measurement practices. So good measurement practices versus not so good measurement practices in the literature that we could theoretically adjudicate about the extent to which this long-standing debates, for example, may be a function of these different measures. All right, so here's the two principal claims. First is that when we look at the literature, if we find high heterogeneity in measurement practices, for example, there's a large number of distinct ideological measures. If these measures vary widely in content, if we go about the measurements in a very different way, then we would find high heterogeneity. And the second is that when applying these different measures to data, if a given theory is replicated or not replicated based on just swapping the ideological scales from one to another, that changes. So clearly one bears on the literature and the second claim bears on data, right? So that's why we need a systematic review for the first one, and we need an empirical assessment for the second one, right? Collecting data on people. All right, so to start with the systematic review and to investigate what are the measurement practices of published research today, we collected a number of indicators of heterogeneity, indicators of quality, and also just to situate the research, there are many ways in which people can measure ideology, but the scope of this is just operational. Well, just is an understatement. It's about operational ideology, right? So we have studies on symbolic, RWA, and STO, which are used sometimes as ideology, and you can imagine how the topics we're discussing today are useful for this as well. All right. Basically, these are all the information we collected for each coded article. All right, so it's about meta information, year of publication, sample specifics like type of sample, sample size, study specifics of the number of studies within an article, the novelty of measures, whether the scales were repeated across studies within the paper, etc. And measurement specific information, so the name, number, whether they used social and economic ideology and so forth, and about information about construct validation. So whether or not we found any evidence of assessment of quality and validity, right? All right, so when it comes to reviewing, we follow Webster and Watson 2002, and we basically did a backward and forward search based on this 7 scales. We found 394, 136 to be a backward search. So that is to say, from the 7 scales, we look the scales that these papers cited, as well as forward search. is when we look at articles and quote articles that have been that cited this 7 papers. And then, so we found 309, then we couldn't access 48, so there was 261 that were available. 47 just to use symbolic ideology. Symbolic ideology is just when you ask people, put yourself in the scale, where do you find yourself into the left, right spectrum? Are you locate yourself within the continuum of liberalism or conservatism? There's many ways to go about it. And finally, we ended up with 207 quoted papers. And what we found when it comes to results is that 3/4 of the papers, so about 75%, are unique measures. So that is to say, and possibly this is the most important finding, is that 3 out of 4 times that we are conducting studies on ideology, we are using unique different ideological scales, right? So this may, to some folks, raise some alarms, and I would be one of these people. 43 of this 152 are unnamed measures, but the most prevalent are Wilson and Patterson, as well as cultural and economic conservatism from DeVita, all right, which were found 98 times versus 49 times for Wilson and Patterson. Yeah, so that's a startling finding, I think. Moving on, when it comes to trends in time, should we worry, right? So these numbers seem overly high, so we consider that perhaps our review revealed practices that are either old or not currently in use. So we can say, oh, it's a different time now, there's the credibility revolution, so maybe we're not looking at this. So in this slide, what we see is the trending time that seems to indicate that the number of measures being created are on the rise. These highly heterogeneous practices are not a problem from yore, but problems that we seem to be grappling now and getting a little bit worse. So it's very much a current problem. And this is an issue to the extent that the literature is already saturated with such measures, and we still keep creating new ones. So this work sort of indicates that this problem is worsening. Of course, as well, we're producing scholarship more than ever. So there's also an effect here confounded with this, that we're also producing more scholarship. So the most, between quotes, conservative approach, interpretation of this graph, it would be that we continue to produce a good amount of novel scales, while not validating, while not looking at quality properties of existing scales. All right, another possibility that we consider is that our review may have focused or may have found only on low-ranking journals. That is to say, journals that are not between quotes of any quality in a way. So unfortunately, however, as you can see on the slide, our review indicates that on average, it is common to find measurement practices that we found in high-ranking journals. So in psychology, we see the flagship journal of political psychology, we see JPSP, we also see Psychological Bulletin, Journal of Personality, and Personality PID. In political science, we find AJPS, so American Journal of Political Science, which is the flagship, the Journal of Politics, POQ, AJPS, and so on. All right. So when looking to break down per field, This is what we found. So we have 28 on other disciplines that involve sociology, economics, genetics, etc. 55 in political science and 104 in psychology. So this all add up, or should add up to 207. And this is a little breakdown, and it's just to show the relative percentages. So basically, psychology kind of accounts for 60% of the articles that we find, and political science about 30%, and other sciences about 10%. So this is not to say that this is representative. This is just has to do with the studies that we found. All right. So far we established, sort of making a summary, that there's a large number of ideological instruments out there, but unlikely as it may be, we did not investigate its content. So it could be that they are all talking about the same thing, right? So we selected 10 ideological instruments and performed a content analysis on their items. So the 3 instruments that are the most cited scales from our review are in here, and they were not included in the initial search. So we sort of expanded our number of scales to look at their content validity. All right, so these are the 10 ideological instruments, and they amount together to 202 items. We found 60 unique topics while using a very conservative approach to broad categories. And in the table, we display the Jockard index. The Jockard index is a statistic used in understanding similarities between sets. And it ranges from 0, so no overlap at all, to 1, total overlap. And as you can see, these results indicate a very low overlap, right? So I highlight in the table the highest similarity index, notably Feldman and Johnston, who use the same data sources, Lehman and Carson, have the highest Jockard index. Yeah, and the other one, Zell and Bernstein, used Pew Research Center data. So there's some similarities there, which is good, but far from what is ideal. So this is just another way of looking at co-occurrence of issue position. So instead of looking at contents per se, we're looking at, okay, so this is about abortion, this is about LGBTQ rights, religion, immigration, sex morals, women's rights, etc. And you can see on the table to your right, their frequency and the content overlap, right? And on the graph on the left, you have the little circles that indicate, for example, let me use this pointer, 1 second. So here, T1 corresponds to this line of the table and talks about abortion. So meaning out of the 10 scales, 9 of them had an item that touched upon abortion, right? So the items are very, very different. They might not be talking about the same thing, but at least they talk about abortion. But the number goes from 9 to 6, 5, and then the relative frequencies decrease by a lot. All right. So we learn that most preference issues are unique, but that the social conservatism as well seems to be the most prevalent domain of the scales, while economic conservatism, so this has to do with filled circles versus empty circles. That's just the differences on the most common sort of approach to ideology. All right, so in the beginning of the talk, I mentioned that we would talk about, well, can we even compare studies that use the same scale? And this is a case study about the C scale. So this is the conservatism scale from Wilson and Patterson from 68 that had 50 original items, right? yeah, so people who agreed normally in the original one, people who agreed to more than half of the items would be considered conservative, for example, right? All right, so ranging from 68 to 2017, we find these scales being used across social sciences, and there's several modified versions, and that's okay, of course, especially when they are validated. But then we start looking at the items, and there's scales that use more items than the original, but mostly other operationalizations. And then when it comes to the measurement, which is a really important part of scale development, there's all sorts of variations, and also when it comes to scoring. So with this graph, I hope to have shown you that even when using the same measure, it's not trivial to compare their results. All right, so here's a summary of the findings up to now, and we'll move now to the empirical side of things. And so we surveyed, we found in more than 200 articles, we found 152 individual measures. That's 3/4. There's very little content overlap between scales. There's substantial heterogeneity, even among the most used scales. Items vary in content, issue representativeness, item format, method, etc. There's I think there's very few validity indications. So we coded just like, is there anything that can be for a Cronbus alpha? True. Yeah, which is the most common thing we found, but is there anything related to validity or not? And only half met this criteria, less than half. There's huge variance in sample size, and we believe that this poses a problem to the comparability and generalizability of findings, which does not help our ability to aggregate knowledge across studies, as well as accumulate knowledge. All right. So a question that I get a lot is, okay, this is not great, but how does that affect my current understanding of the literature? So to summarize, it doesn't matter, right? The literature is somewhat a mess. There's high variability and heterogeneity on how things are measured, but the question is, to what extent does it matter? Does it matter practically? Meaning, are ideological instruments interchangeable in practice? When we collect data, we investigate our hypothesis, right? So are ideological instruments equally good indicators, for example? Do they present equally good validity properties? Can they be used interchangeably to arrive at the same result? So those are the questions that can be broken down from this general question. So more globally, if we conduct research with one specific instrument, can we draw conclusions about the nature of ideology in general? And I believe this also generalizes to other constructs that are known to have several scales. Empathy, for example, emotions, and there's several other constructs. All right, so in all likelihood, the answer to the question, are ideological instruments interchangeable, won't be black and white. So we'll check it out with an empirical study. So this is the study design. Basically, it's a professional survey company collected data on American adults. They were representative when it comes to age, income, education, and gender. We also did an exploratory as well as a confirmatory analysis. So only when findings coalesce across samples, we reported them here. And this was collected in 2016. It took quite a while to put this paper together. And we also used checks for carelessness and satisficing, as well as consistency checks and time checks. All right, so again, it's the same scales as I presented before, and we survey 5 scales. It's actually 6 because social conservatism and economic conservatism are put together by the same author to form this Hennigan scale between both. All right, so we're going to present 4 case studies, and well, Edison Stimson, Leukish, 2016, one of my own works that we use multiverse analysis, and Lee Druckmann's on the composition of the American electorate. All right, so the first case study is the famous books by Edison Stimson, Ideology in America. If you haven't read it, it's a great, great, great book, and very well empirically based. They do use, I believe, more than 1,000 items. I should get that number memorized, but I always forget. But it's an absurd high number. And what they posited basically is that Americans are symbolically conservative and operationally liberal. So that means that whenever you ask Americans, or most Americans, or the population in general, most Americans will say, oh, I'm either moderate or mostly conservative. So you see that this on the symbolic distribution. So if you ask their opinion, the symbolic conservatism distribution will be shifted towards the right. So Americans mostly identify themselves symbolically as conservatives. Operational ideologies, when you ask about policy preferences, and this can be done via means, adding scales, etc. But when you ask them about LGBT rights, abortion, the influence of government, etc., and when you ask them about policy preferences, they are mostly liberal, which is one of the most interesting aspects about the American public, right? So that's their hypothesis. So the question is, can we find the same results? All right. So, so this is just simulated data to show that operational ideology and symbolic ideology, right? So how would it look like? This is what we look like if we are able to disprove, or maybe not disprove, but to show how would it look like when a scale does not yield the expected results. So just to contrast, you have the green distribution shifting from one side to the other, and the relative position of the lines, which indicates the mean of the distribution. All right, so let's look at data. And here on the left, you have the average scale, Feldman and Johnston, Hennigan, Ingvar, Bizarro, and Bloom, and Zahn Bernstein. And what we show here is the following. So we have one scale, which is in purple, that shows that measuring operational conservatism would actually yield a very conservative distribution among the public. Then we have two scales, Feldman and Joseph and Bernstein, that would agree with the findings in Ideology in America. And we have Hennigan and Barr, Pizarro, and Bloom, which would be near the population median, which means just a no effect. So it doesn't replicate, right? So we have 2 in agreement, 2 that doesn't replicate, and we have here a reversal. A reversal in the context of a replication is when the original effect size is flipped, goes against the original, the direction of the effect size goes against the original claim. All right, so this is not great. Basically, this is one of the most important findings in political science, and it's highly dependent on the scale that you use. Right. So the next paper is on Public Opinion Quarterly by Leukish 2016, and claims that most Americans are not yet ideologically polarized. And Leukish uses this divergence aspect of polarization, which has to do with different distributions. So on your left, you have here 3 categories: low polarization, moderate, and high polarization, and just the distributions here and the hedges G. Hedges G is a measure of effect size, and you have here the bimodality coefficient. So to what extent are we looking at 2 distributions, and Hartigan's dip test, and the p-value of whether there's 2 distributions or not. And Leukish in particular used a very stringent test, and I would argue that the tests that he chooses to use are too conservative and very prone to not find polarized results, as I'll show you. But for example, here I believe there's clearly 2 distributions. The 2 distributions, a hedges D of 2.4, but the p-value is still 0.6 on Hartigan's dip test, meaning that here it's not considered polarized. But that's beyond the point of this presentation in particular, just to show that just to talk a little bit about polarization as well. All right, so what do we find when we look at the results? So we find here that basically in agreement with Leukish, we have 3 scales. One of them is symbolic ideology, and we have 3 scales that would actually yield a significant p-value, meaning that there would be 2 distributions that we are observing here, meaning that there is polarization. So again, findings are idiosyncratic to the scales used. If you had used this scale, Hennigan or Everett, or even symbolic ideology, using the same methods and using Leukish, you would find similar results as in Leukish, but if you use other scales, you wouldn't have. All right. So the case study number 3 is a study. Oh, I see there's a question. All right. You're welcome, Andreas. Thank you. Here we basically we're interested in predicting distrust in climate change, and we put together a study that had 15 different predictors of climate change distrust, and we were interested in which of them survived if we ran literally all possible models. The references to the side there, it's quite an interesting study, but basically we showed that ideology over and above seems to be a predictor of climate change distrust. But what is interesting in this graph is that in the blue boxes here are the ideological scales, and you can see here the distributions of the slope coefficients. So let me backtrack a little bit. So multiverse analysis is you basically feed all possible models, and I just add age, for example, and remove is the age a predictor. And then I add one other variable in age, and then another variable in age. And I look at the sort of the significancy and the magnitude of that slope coefficient. So here the distribution and on the bottom are close to 0, meaning that they are not significant predictors, or their effect size are not very large. And that means, for example, that system justification is only a significant predictor of distrust in climate change about 13% of the times. However, operational ideology via Zell and Bernstein is 1, so 100%, and so is in bar, bizarre, and blue. and symbolic ideology, social dominance, and then partisanship is only 87%. So the point here is that some scales are always predictive, while other scales are not. So once again, we show that there is high heterogeneity on findings depending on the scale used. All right, last case before we sort of wrap up the presentation is that Lee Druckmann in 2016, this is probably one of the most famous pictures in at least political behavior, and it shows that in blue here you have Democrat Clinton voters, and in red you have Trump voters, and this is supposed to represent their voters distribution within the social and economic axis, and to show that most folks are economically and socially liberal, so it would be in this area, and you have the conservative movement here, or the conservatives in the US are mostly this middle of the top part of the graph. So I wanted to replicate that in particular with respect to the very little frequency of points or people here, which are sort of the libertarians in a way. So this would be the populists, and this would be the libertarians under, again, their operationalization. So what we find, again, this is the original, and we find that this percentage of people here is very much dependent on the scales that is used, and varies a lot from I think 7% to 23%, but it varies a lot. In any case, again, this is dependent. So the main takeaway of this presentation is that we have been conducting research in ideology as if we're all using one and the same measure, a single predefined, well-tested, cross-nationally validated measure. So we're doing research as if we all had this standardized measure, but we are not. And this is what we showed in this empirical study. And the consequence, the downstream consequences of this research program is that we're saying that we show evidence that findings are particular to scales themselves, which poses a threat to the replicability and generalizability of findings. All right, so just to taking stock, so we found that these characteristics have been associated in the literature with an increased failure to replicate. We also find that research on ideology is riddled with jingle-jangle fallacies. If you don't know what that is, jingle-jangle fallacies refer to the erroneous assumption that two different things are the same because they bear the same name. So conservatism is chaos. And that's the jingle fallacy. And jangle fallacy is when two identical or almost identical things are considered to be different just because they are labeled differently. So that's jangle fallacy. All right. So altogether, based on the literature and quoting more than 400 articles, we speculate that it's unlikely that operational measures of ideology are unlikely equally good indicators of ideology, are unlikely to present equally desirable validity properties, and are unlikely that they can be used interchangeably. All right, so an important implication of all of this is that the conceptual this conceptual and measurement problem that has pervaded research on the consequences of ideological thinking. So one of the main questions for folks studying ideology is whether the public is ideological or isn't. So, however, if the basic measure of ideology is flawed, it is likely that insights that have been drawn using these scales, whether people are ideological or not so sure to be trusted. So without reliable measurement, and it's hard to assert about the level of ideological thinking. And I would venture a guess that this is likely being underestimated, that the relationship between ideology and individual opinions are probably more complicated and contingent that they appear as per the literature. All right, so let's talk a little bit about discussion and outlooks. So for example, one of the ways that we can do this is to push for institutional efforts towards standardized measurement. So have scales that have properties known across the groups or that are validated in time and have some invariant properties. We can also go about this via theory and have a very specific theory that dictates how this how its instrument should measure ideology. We can also qualify findings from now on based on the instrument that you're using rather than ideology more broadly. We can also use more careful methods to develop and report instruments validity properties. For example, use test equating methods. Those are recommendations on how we can move forward. So this is still work in progress. We should come up with a preprint in a matter of a month and a website that we look forward to, because we did all this amazing visualizations. Well, we think that they're amazing, but we did the school visualizations and we're going to put it on a website. Hopefully you will be able to see them very soon. And we have a few projects on the go that we have conceptualized, and maybe if you're interested in participating or investigating more things on this topic, we would be open to hear your proposal and talk to you about, because there's this amazing data set, both empirical and of the literature, and a lot of things can be investigated that could be interesting. So please consider talking to us if this is at all interesting to you and to your research. And also help us improve our work. So are there more theories that we can test? We tested a few more, but just for the sake of simplicity, they're not here. So what other instruments you want to see highlighted? And we're also open to suggesting how to solve this problem. All right, so we arrive at the end for questions. And I would like to thank my best co-author, Julia Ballista, as well as our research assistants that helped us in this endeavor. And I'll stop recording now and open for questions.